Welcome to the Indie Pub, a laid-back interview show dedicated to the world of self and indie publishing. I'm your host, Jay Rushing, author of the self-published fantasy noir novel Radio, and a beverage buff with a passion for deep dives and good times. Every 2 weeks, a guest will step into the pub with a publishing-related topic and a favorite drink for us to explore and enjoy. Whether you want to sharpen your craft, snag a new cocktail recipe, or just have a laugh, there's always a seat and a full glass waiting for you at the Indie Pub. Welcome to the Indie Pub. Author and professional designer KMAlexander is back with us, and this time he's dishing out all kinds of tips, tricks, and resources surrounding map making for books, particularly fantasy maps. He's the author of the Belforging Cycle, a series of Lovecraftian-inspired urban fantasies, including the recently released fourth book in the series, Gleam Upon the Waves. But before we dive in, tell us a bit about what we're drinking here in the pub today.
Well, good evening. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely.
I get to be the guest that returns. So.
Hell yeah. Friend
of the pod. Today, we are drinking Grog. And I figured since we're talking maps for fantasy, we'd be talking about kind of old stuff. So I started to dig in to try to come up with like an old cocktail. And Grog, which was served on board ship vessels, both exploration and naval, or what everybody served it, was one that I thought we'd settle on. Do you want me to go into like the recipe right now? Should we talk about like what?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so this is 2 ounces of rum. Any rum works. The recommended is Navy strength rum, which is really strong. And then it's 2 teaspoons of brown sugar, a half an ounce of lime juice, and a half an ounce of water. And then you just mix it all up. And then I would serve it up. I would not serve it over rocks because it tends to get, we're already watering it down and it tends to get even more watered down. So you start to lose flavors if you put it over rocks for any considerable length of time. But yeah, that's what we're having.
Grog a day keeps the scurvy away.
That's right.
We'll have to add a little bit of growl and some extra R's to our conversation.
Talk like a pirate as we discuss maps.
All right, go ahead and remind us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Yeah, so as you said, my name's KMAlexander. I'm the writer of the Belforging Cycle, which is cosmic horror soaked urban fantasy. It takes place in a world after Lovecraft's creatures kind of showed up, wrecked shop, and then disappeared back into myth. And thousands of years later, a new society has kind of risen from the ashes of the old world. So it's a weird mix of genres, like a post-apocalypse. So it's after the post-apocalypse setting. So that's generally what I write. We talked kind of about mixing genre last time, and this time we're going to talk about maps, which has kind of become more of a new hobby of mine. Kind of started in 2019 and has really ramped up from there. So, yeah.
I know that for me, speaking of maps, they definitely have an allure. Whether it's a modern map, a historical map, fictional, or actually like a functional map, I just am drawn to them. Globes as well, but there's some magic to them. What draws you? What started that hobby?
So it really helps me establish place. And it's one of those things is like a photograph is fine, but like unless you know where that photograph is taken, you're lacking this extra level of context that I think really I just get infatuated with. And so the idea of like, oh, that road exists here. Well, what's that like? What's that connected to? What's the flora and the fauna and the landscape that, creates that sense of place? There's also this aspect of world building that I think comes into it, and like understanding the world in a more of a macro level as opposed to like a micro level. And maps allow for both, which is the cool thing about them. You can have a map of someone's house, right? Or you can have a map of the city it's in, or the county, or the state, or the province, or whatever. And like you can just keep going out from there. So it's like that level of nuance is so fascinating to me that it really allows you to explore a space, and you can just look at a map and really see history in maps. And I've kind of become, especially because of the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, a bit of like an amateur historian, just reading lots of history and so like that aspect of maps where you could see, the old walls around a city, but then also see these like little villages that have cropped up that have now become suburbs. Like you start to get the history of, say, a area in a way that like I don't think you can always get in other forms. Like you either have to read a whole book or, go explore the space yourself or what have you. Like a map lets you kind of see a lot of that in a very interesting way and presenting that information in a really interesting way. So I think that's a really long-winded answer as to why I'm drawn to maps.
And so you've been on the show before, and like we said earlier, we've kind of talked about you, the author. Mm-hmm. But there's another half of your life that comes into play when it comes to your interest in and expertise with map, in particular map making. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about that other half of you.
Yeah. So I professionally, my title is Director of Design / User Experience. I've been a designer now for 20 years. I can do illustration, I can do typography, logo design, and I mostly work in software these days. But I've been very passionate about design and graphic design. And so it was really natural that I gravitate towards these aspects of design within writing as well. And that includes things like map making, which is funny because I don't actually have maps in any of my books, which we'll get to. We could probably talk about that a little later on. But I do have maps. And I think I've always really liked that aspect. I mean, I do all my own book design. I do the cover designs of my books. I do interior layout. I do all that sort of stuff. And like, you can do as much as you want or as little as you want, and kind of figuring that whole aspect out has really played a part in my creation of fiction. And then I fell in love with maps, and then I saw opportunities to kind of be able to support other authors, because it's something that a lot of indie, in particular, because the indie fantasy community is so huge and is only growing, which is great to see. Like, I know that maps are something everybody talks about. It's something you see in forums get discussed. It's something I see people discussing on Twitter. There's now map reveals that I see, like book bloggers will have, posts about and things like that. So like, it's clearly become a part of the fantasy zeitgeist. And so it's a thing that I could see myself helping to support as a designer that, does this professionally for a day job as well.
All right, so let's dive into book maps in particular.
Yeah.
What are some of your favorites? What are some that you think, when thinking back, really, really struck you as being either beautiful or effective, or I guess preferably both? But are there any that really stick in your mind?
Yeah. 4 come to mind, and I'll go through these actually in chronological order from like oldest to the most recent.
Okay.
I think I recently made a post actually about the one I'm going to talk about first, and that's the map for Treasure Island. And I think what I'll do, I'll send you these maps so you can like post them on your blog or something, so then people listening to the podcast can go and see these maps and see what we're talking about, because it's always helpful, great idea. Especially because it's so visual to have. Yeah. And the map that actually Ship of Treasure Island is the map of the titular Treasure Island, and it looks like a nautical chart. Like, it has like the soundings, it has like little markings around it that show like where, rocks or things, you know how to read nautical charts, like all these little bits and bobs on the, and so like seeing that map, I think, really helped. Like, it really kind of inspired me when I like read the book as a kid, and like was like, oh, I totally can picture this. And I felt like a pirate, because it looks like a pirate map, right? It's like that nautical chart. So that one's the first one that comes to mind. The next one, which is a little different, because I think it kind of goes against what we would associate with as fantasy maps anymore, is Ursula K. Le Guin's map that she drew herself for Earthsea. And from a design standpoint, it has this very, like, it doesn't look like a professional artist drew the map. It's very rough in that aspect. But it still captures this magic that I think we all see when we make maps. Like, I used to draw maps as a kid, right? Like, I mean, it's just a thing that I think, when you're inspired by that sort of stuff, you're inspired by that sort of stuff. And I think it has this playful and this whimsical quality that kind of expands the world of Earthsea and the world that Le Guin has created. And it also was like the first map that really kind of put me out of the standard everything's continents and like this standard kind of, Mercator projection that we all grow up with as kids. And because it's like, the world is essentially this giant archipelago of islands. And so it was like, oh man, you could write stories and something like that. Just like such a cool concept. And seeing it like that, being able to see all these, hundreds of little islands with their own names and their own cult, like, is really cool. Something that's really inspiring. So that one comes to mind too. More recently, I think a map that stands out to me is, have you read any of Brian McClellan's Powder Mage series?
I haven't, no.
They're great books, and his maps are done by what's his name? Isaac Stewart, he's the same guy that does like Brandon Sanderson's maps. And the stuff that he's done for the Powder Mage series for Brian McClellan works so well for me because it, like, you have this kind of flintlock fantasy setting and the maps look like they're made in that era. Like, they have this very much this like late 17th century, early 18th century, even mid 18th century quality to them. And the one that jumps out a lot is the city of Adopest, which I think is in the first book. Like, there's actually 3 maps, I think, in like almost every single one of his books that are, for whatever is happening in the trilogy. But it evokes these qualities that remind me a lot of like maps of Paris from like, 1740 or, maps of London. Like, you can see the little blocks and you can see sometimes like it's hard to tell, like even individual like buildings that make up the blocks and like, like those aspects really come into play. And I think it if anything, it helps really cement the world in that kind of era. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that industrial revolution point in history, you get dates with maps a lot more often, and watching, like, 'cause for my book, I had tons of Paris maps, and
I was going to say, you've seen maps of Paris.
Yeah, and just watching the city grow.
Yeah.
Year after, it's like you find a map that's close-ish to the date you want, and then you see it and you're using that for a while until you find one that's closer, and then you get to see all the changes, which means you have to revise a bunch of things in the book. But still, it's really, really great to be able to watch, those changes in a visual format.
It's like especially city maps are like capturing a moment in time, and you really see that, especially with the city of Adopest map. It really is capturing that city at a moment in crisis. Really, the book takes place during essentially a coup, so it's like, that one stands out a lot to me. And then the other one that I'm going to bring up, which is, it's still book related, but it's an RPG map, is this map that was created by a designer named Johan Noor, and I'm probably butchering his name, for a RPG system called Morkborg, which I also I've heard it said. I've heard it called Morkborg. I've heard it called Merkborg, and I've seen it called Mjorkborg. So it's one of those.
Is it a bunch of umlauts or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha.
It's this Swedish doom metal dark fantasy RPG.
That sounds amazing.
And the design is incredible. Like, it looks like you're looking through doom metal covers. And the map for the world is as weird and black and it's just fascinating. And there's not a ton of like details, it just kind of hints at like, oh, here's the Valley of the Unfortunate Dead, or, here's the city of Grift, or here, the whole continent surrounded by the endless sea, and nobody either don't come back for it or you come back insane kind of thing. And like it's never, a lot of times maps get remade by fans anyways, and this really evokes tone in a way that to me just kind of unlocks things from the setting, like just this bleak doom metal world, right? Like everyone dies. And it carries that through. And it's very different. The entire design of the system is probably one of the best I've seen in recent memory, but it's not something, it's just very different. Focusing so much, it kind of goes against the norm in a way that I think is really fascinating. So like that's the other one of the like maps that stand out to me that I think are really fascinating right now, and were really fascinating in the past. So those are my 4.
All right, so with those in mind, what do you feel are some of the necessary gotta have them elements that make a map good, or make it work? Say.
Well, I mean, maps in general you're organizing information in a way that's digestible. So I think a map for novels in particular needs to really serve the story just as much as the prose does. I don't ever think a map should be necessary. Like you shouldn't write like you have to have a map to understand. There's some authors that don't do that, and you end up flipping a lot. It should really reinforce the story you're trying to tell. And a lot of times what people tend to do, which kind of plays against this, is they'll over design something. And there's a place for that. But for a map, for a book, I think you really want to, it's a less is more thing. So you pull out what's not necessary and you leave really what's there. So really it's going to be things for fantasy that will affect the plot. Mountain ranges, it's all going to be setting stuff, right? Like it's a map, city locations, borders, like, where the zombie army is at a given time or what have you. Like those are the sort of things, like you're really trying to organize, you're organizing data in a way that communicates to the reader kind of the place that you're introducing them to as a world. And I think without those kind of things, you're really just giving, they're not going to get anything from it. And there's a book, and I can't remember the author's name. It's called The Traitor Baruch Cormorant, I believe is the name of the book. And it kind of goes against this whole idea of a map, where it shows this world that takes place. It's broken up into duchies. And really it's kind of presented as like, this is my notes on the leaders of these duchies. So it doesn't tell you like all the villages or where the mountain ranges are necessarily, but it'll tell you that, oh, I don't like this guy. He's got a weird beard and he smells bad, or just like that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And like, it's still a map. It's showing kind of the location of where these people live, but it's taking it in a way and presenting information in a way that is useful for the reader, because it is influencing kind of, oh, it's giving me this insight into a character who's the one that would be creating this sort of map. So it's like, those are the sort of things that I think are really necessary to have to make a successful map, is really those, like finding those elements that are important to the story and then executing on those elements within the map. So we could just take radio as an example. You didn't need a map for radio, but you could potentially release a map of like where radio is. And it wouldn't necessarily need to be, here's Paris and all the street names. Like you would hit the main ones, but like it'd be interesting to show where the clubs are, right? Because you can't go find where those clubs are on Google Maps, because they don't always, they've become something else over time. And like those are the sort of things that you would kind of, if you were to create a map for radio, you would really like hone in on like those locations the story takes place in. Here's the location of, you know, the apartment versus here's where the, you know, Eiffel Tower is. Like, you know, you might show like the Riverwalk area or some of those other aspects, because those are the things that kind of clue into the story. I think you also need to be careful that you don't want to necessarily give away spoilers.
Yeah.
Because spoilers, you know, you don't want that necessarily in the map, but you do get an opportunity to really set up this like anticipation, right? So like you have locations that you may not talk about right away, but then slowly becomes, oh, that's important. Oh, where's that at? Oh, they got to go there. What's there? Like you can build anticipation just by having just a simple little label that says this is, you know, whatever location and that sort of thing. So like, I think those are the sort of aspects that really can help make a map work really well for fantasy authors.
I like that point. I think like the big take home for me from that I think is really a little eye-opening for somebody who doesn't necessarily think about book maps, because I tend not to make that something that I'm definitely going to include. But just the idea that it needs to do work for your story, but that the work it's doing doesn't have to be the same work as your typical road atlas or things like that. Like you can really choose what information your map is conveying. That's really kind of a breath of fresh air, idea-wise. I like that.
There's a phrase, I can't remember who said it, but all maps are propaganda. Like,
I like that.
Maps are propaganda. And they were used as propaganda. We'll talk about my map tools a little bit later on, but I've been doing this research on this cartographer. It's kind of a loose sense of the word. His name is Defer. And a lot of his maps were essentially propaganda for the king, where it was like, oh, we own this country, we own this part. It's like they don't really own that. Like it's clearly, you know, but like you see this happen all the time where, you know, a map will be released by a country that claims they own another part or calls it a different name. I'm not naming names necessarily, but
South China Sea.
But like it's not an uncommon thing, and it happened in the States too when it you know especially during you know the rush west, and like maps are propaganda, and so it's like how do you use that you're making propaganda for your novel. What do you want it to say? You know, it's just as much a part of that as it, you know, it isn't. So.
All right. Well, let's take another sippy sap of our grog. And like we do in every episode, we talk about the two most ignored senses in writing, taste and smell. What are you getting off of this? What is this nautical libation doing to your senses?
So much of this, I think, is going to be driven by the rum you choose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't think I chose a great rum. It's fine. I almost think you would get more, especially on the nose, if you had like a spiced rum. If you had a Navy strength rum, you're just going to smell alcohol because that stuff is like potent.
Yeah.
It's like 54% alcohol or something. I get a lot of lime actually in this, which makes sense. It's like half an ounce. It's a lot of lime to keep that scurvy away.
Yep.
And then I get a little bit like the brown sugar. I mean, rum is already sugar, so it's like sugar on top of sugar. So you do get that kind of toasty, caramely sugar smell too. At least with the I just chose a dark rum called Plantation, which I had never heard of. I usually would get like Mount Gay, but they didn't have any in the liquor store when I went to it. And the one that I saw recommended, which was like a British one, it was called like Pusser. I don't remember the exact name. That they had like one that was like $100, and then the other ones were all sold out. And I was like, I'm not going to spend $100 on grog. So, but like, what rum did you make with yours?
I went with good old Kraken. And I know a lot of people in the drinks world kind of shit on Kraken a little bit, but I don't care. It's fantastic. And it is super tasty. It's not something you would just sip neat necessarily, but for a mixer, when it comes to a dark spiced rum, I personally haven't found one I like better. So for me, I will take the Kraken any day. And here, what I did with mine was I did Kraken, which already has some vanilla notes and, those really nice, deep.
You're probably getting a lot more
spicy
sense of smell than I am.
Yeah, it's not just the lime coming through. You're getting that rum smell, the vanilla definitely. One thing I did, because American brown sugar is super difficult to get in Europe. Basically, the UK has it, the US has it, but continental Europe, you have to basically go to a specialty store. So what I did is I used turbinado sugar and then stirred in and dissolved just a touch of molasses.
Oh, yeah.
I did a little more than I probably should have, but I like it. So I would recommend that, because and also it gives it a little bit more of that Caribbean vibe
for just
yeah,
like almost no sugar. You can just do the molasses. Mm-hmm. I saw recipes that had molasses was on some recipes. So like I do know that this was essentially a drink made for sailors, right? So it was like, here, we'll keep scurvy away. You get it was a lot more than 2 ounces. I think it was like a cup of rum a day or whatever. So you're happy and you're also healthy. And please don't mutiny. So, because this was pretty common, even through the Revolutionary War, right? There's documents of Washington making sure that his men get their rum or whiskey.
Yeah.
They're because you can't have good soldiers unless they're have libations, I suppose. Yeah. So yeah, taste wise, which we talked about the smell. Taste wise, you definitely get that caramel rum sort of like classic, sugar liquor flavor. Yeah. Again, the lime is really strong. The water aspect really mellows it out. You may even consider leaving it out. I think if you're making this at home, try it without water and then add water as you see fit. A lot of that was they added water because A, they didn't want drunk sailors, and B, they wanted to make the rum last a lot longer. So there's aspects there that you can choose if you're making this just for an evening sipper. It's not going to be super strong, just adding even a little bit of water, but it's something to at least consider. But flavors are definitely I think I said before we started, it's like a Mai Tai with all the extra fruit and kind of that almond. It reminds me of a really simple kind of Mai Tai sort of vibe to it.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'm finding really, really interesting, and I might want to try it, experimenting with other drinks, is this version's basically a cocktail, and you rarely, if ever, drink a cocktail at room temperature, and it affects the flavors and the smells so much because temperature affects what volatiles are released. And it's really interesting to see. I would love to make another one of these super chilled and see how different it comes across. But at room temperature, you typically think, oh, my cocktail's warm, it's not good anymore. But that might not actually be the case. And with this one, it definitely works at room temperature.
Yeah. I agree. And rum is one of those things. It's kind of like whiskey where you can have it warm and it's not going to ruin. If anything, warm rum really releases some of those sugary notes that you don't always get if it's cold. But this definitely, it'd be interesting to try this chilled. I wonder if it would be almost more citrusy because you really would kind of withhold some of the aspects of rum. I don't know.
It'd be interesting to use a rum agricole as well, just as an experiment, and see kind of that more vegetal notes that come out with one of those. It'd be really, really interesting.
Yeah, that would be interesting. But it's still good. I don't know if I would seek it out all the time, but it was definitely worth the experiment. I kind of like your idea of kind of mixing with it a little bit more and trying to, make adding molasses, adding the bitters is a nice touch. That is one thing that I do like. But I'm a big fan of aromatic bitters, so I always put a little bit more than recommended. That is a nice touch. It's not something I've ever had with rum before. So
have you ever used Boker's bitters?
Mm-mm.
It's I forget the company. It's one of the hundreds of pre-prohibition bitters that went under during Prohibition, but there's one company that dug up the recipe and painstakingly went through trying to recreate it. So I know it as Boker's because that's the original name and that's what it's labeled as, but it's a different company making it. Okay. Anyway, it's another aromatic bitters, but it's, at least to me, it's a bit clove forward. Oh. And so it's a really nice contrast to Angostura. So if you ever want to have, if you need to use that type of bitters in a drink, I recommend picking up a bottle and swapping it out because it changes it just enough to be interesting. Anyway,
one thing that might be another addition, just since we're talking bitters, would be either a cardamom bitter or a orange bitter.
Yeah,
or both, or both those. Yeah, I think would be a nice addition to what's going on here in our grog.
Yeah, you could do either an orange bitters or you could swap some of the sugar for like a triple sec, and then go with the. So I don't use them very often, but I made just a ton of tinctures.
Yeah,
which is basically just single flavored bitters. So I have some green cardamom tincture somewhere that I should try. I should try that out. I bet that would be fantastic.
Well, it's evening there, so you can have a second drink after this.
I could if I hadn't already made a double.
Fair.
But I might anyway. Who knows? Bed is just a few steps away, so I think I can manage.
Nice.
All right, so let's jump back to our maps.
Yeah.
And let's talk about the making aspect of this. How should one approach making their own maps for their books? Are there certain techniques or resources that you would recommend? Strategies, things like that?
Yeah. Well, if you are not artistic and you have no desire to be artistic, hire somebody.
Yeah.
There's a ton of illustrators out there. It won't cost you thousands of dollars to have a map made for your book. Under 500 easily, I think. Oh. There's going to be people that are very, very good that will obviously you'll pay them accordingly. But there's a lot of people that are good that are just getting started that you'll be able to get custom illustration essentially done for your book. So that's like always, if you're not interested in making your own maps, that's the best way to go. Beyond that, there's tons of tools out there. There's a lot of good communities. The Cartographers Guild is one that I'm a part of, that is essentially a bunch of professional cartographers and amateur, and all they do is post and make fantasy maps. Incredible work there. Really good place to go and just glean information from. There's a few fantasy map forums on Reddit. I think Our Fantasy Maps is kind of one that's a big one. Also, Our Map Making is another one that are both focused on the creation of maps, and you can at least get information from there. So those are good. Those are good starting points. Then there's software out there, and you can use a wide variety of software. I have a post on my blog, which is resources for, authors, or if you're a game master that's just running tabletop RPG campaigns, like ways to make maps. There's map generation tools out there. Uncharted Atlas, Asgard, the Planet Map Generator, the GM World Map, Watabu, I might be saying that name wrong, has like a city generator, which is really cool. It's like a couple clicks. You can adjust things really easy, really straightforward. A lot of people get hung up on maps, and you don't necessarily have to get hung up on maps. Unless you have very specific things in mind. But if you're just setting like a crime drama in a fantasy city, an auto-generated map's not a bad way to go, right? Like you don't have to sit there and if anything, it can kind of help you tell a story where you have to figure out like, how does this guy escape from the bank here and get over to the vault here or whatever. So like there's some aspects to just the automatic generation that exists out there. There's some map tools that people, World Spinner, Incarnate, Roll for Fantasy, Map Gen 4. These are more of the like map creation softwares that let you that kind of lets you build maps out. Incarnate's probably the most popular of the ones I mentioned. The other one that comes to mind, which we'll probably talk about a little later on, is Wonder Draft, which is kind of the new kid on the block, and that one lets you. It's pretty straightforward as far as like placing objects or the signs within your maps. So like that's another option. And then obviously there's the big tools like Photoshop the Affinity tool set, GIMP if you don't want to pay for it and you want open source. Like there's lots of like that's kind of the like I'm really dedicated to the art of map making. I'm going to install Photoshop on my computer, and you can do that as, in my opinion, as a novice and actually crank out a pretty decent map. There's a lot of good tools out there, and those sites that I mentioned, they have like everybody has like tutorials like how to do realistic coastlines, and a lot of it you just follow some instructions and you get some pretty realistic stuff from it. Again, it's going to depend on the style that you want. Obviously a more illustrated style is going to require illustration skills. If you want more of a simplistic style, that can use some really basic symbol sets that you can download from the internet. A really good map that gets talked about a lot, but has gone through all these iterations, so we all have different visuals in our head. George R. R. Martin's maps from his books. If you look at the ones that are actually in the book, they're so different than the ones fans make online. They're really simple. They're basically there to communicate information. They're not there to look like they were made in, the Middle Ages. They don't look like that at all. They look like they were made in Adobe Illustrator. They're like vector based, right? Like it's just little simple wave symbols for the ocean. But they're still like, it's really there to communicate really effectively. And I think that's okay to do, because really what is happening with that map is it's just trying to tell you where things are at. So when someone's traveling, the distance or that sort of thing. Since then, it's become, someone's taken it and we've seen 1,000 iterations of that, from realistic to Google Map versions. So it really, that's the fan base going wild with it. But the actual map itself wasn't trying to evoke, like it's really there to communicate information, do nothing more. It's not trying to world build as well. So it's a little different.
It's funny you bring that map up, because I don't know whether or not it's a faux pas, but there's something about just taking the UK and Ireland and turning it upside down that feels a little bit, maybe not wrong, but maybe a touch of cheating. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Because I once someone pointed that out to me, my jaw kind of dropped a little bit.
I don't. In the end, it doesn't matter.
It does, yeah.
You're gonna is it cheating? Yeah, but it's a way to get a pretty easy, realistic coastline. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the weather and everything makes sense.
Yeah.
Preserved.
Are there other ways to do that? Yeah, there are. like it's, my guess is at the time, George R. R. Martin was like, half that's done by hand. He communicated it to, the illustrator who did it, like on a paper napkin, most likely, because it's not an uncommon thing. And the illustrator worked with that. And it is Ireland, the UK, flipped around, and you can tell. But he's not alone as well. Excuse me. There's I've seen, I can't remember the name. There's a few people that have taken Antarctica and flipped upside down, or reversed the Atlantic Ocean, and that became a continent. So there's ways to do that. And I don't think unless you're really going to get into talking about plate tectonics, it's the coastline's the coastline, and it's gonna be about the adventures of the characters along that coastline, not about how that coastline's formed. So I don't think you have to get too hung up about it. If you went and did the same thing, people would call you out on it and be like, "That looks like Westeros. What the heck?" Yeah. And you'd have to answer for that. So,
all right, you've been releasing these stylized brush sets for people to be able to make at home.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about that. Where did the idea come from? How did you get started? Take us into that process a little bit.
So some of it, I mentioned that map from Adopest and really the entire maps from the series kind of all fit within that kind of era. And it was the first map that I saw that really seemed to set. So we should probably acknowledge that a huge chunk of fantasy mapping is driven by Tolkien. Mm. The map of Middle Earth. Anytime somebody has a discussion about fantasy mapping, Tolkien comes up, because it's just so present within the zeitgeist. We all know it. We've seen it since we were kids. It's just there. And that style is really become kind of the style associated with fantasy, where the signs are like little drawings of mountains or little tiny trees, or you see like little swamps and here's a city, you know, like those. And a lot of that is driven from the maps of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, kind of the age of exploration. A lot of it's Dutch driven because the Dutch had these giant shipping companies that went everywhere, and they were making maps. And, you know, we're talking about America is just barely showing up on the scene, you know, and doesn't really come until like the 18th century. And so like 17th century, it's kind of this blank spot. And so a lot of it's the wilds, right? And so like they might have like a few ports that are down along the coast, but the rest of it just kind of fades into just, you know, bramble, because they don't really know what's beyond a few hundred miles inland. So like that has really driven fantasy mapping. So a lot of times these books are set in an era that doesn't really line up with the maps that we see. So a lot of the maps that would have come from that same era, we wouldn't really get much out of them as modern people. Like those maps tended to be more typography, like typography. So London would just be spelled out kind of where London was, and then you wouldn't get much more than that. Like it wasn't like trying to show you all the bends of the river necessarily. They were a little bit broader, like the map of Mundis, which are like really common, which were like kind of the maps of the known world at the time, like are incredibly inaccurate. And really until you started to get exploration and things like the sextant and stuff showing up on scene, that's when maps got a lot more accurate. There's like stories of like people getting lost because the maps were just so wrong. So because Tolkien honed in on, like, nobody's making maps that look like they're coming from, you know, the Middle Ages, because most of them didn't survive. And the ones that did survive have these kind of like illuminated manuscript style that doesn't lend itself to really communicating tons of information the way that a modern reader would, you know, absorb it. So when I was looking at like maps like Tolkien, and then I saw the maps from like the Powder Mage books in particular, I really was like, you know, these look like old maps that came from the, you know, the 17th and 18th century. So I started looking there, and I was like, these into essentially stamps that somebody could select and just stamp onto, and then they'd be able to create a map that feels like it's coming from a very specific era without having any illustration skills. And it would feel hand drawn, because a lot of those maps, they're hand drawing every single one of those. You know, let's take a mountain range, right? Every mountain's hand drawn. And when you do that, you get these little, even if the mountains are similar in construction, there's enough variance that they feel different. And so it feels hand drawn. It's like, I'm like, well, if I take a bunch of these and I create these, they're called brushes in Photoshop because that's what I was using initially. So I create these brushes that work as stamps. Like I could have like 100 of them, and even if one or two of them repeat, the reader's memory isn't going to necessarily remember that. Like they'd have to go through looking for repeating mountains.
Now, can these brush sets only be used with Photoshop, or will they work in multiple programs?
Right now, they'll work in Photoshop, GIMP, and Affinity. And they should work pretty straightforward in all those. There's the new tool I was talking about, Wonder Draft. I don't do the conversion, but there's a guy out there named Richard Moyer who's been taking them and converting them into sets that work with Wonder Draft. So you could still use them with Wonder Draft as well. So you don't need just Photoshop to work. That just happens to be the tool I have. Yeah. I'm a designer. It's on my machine. I'm using that. So, and then they're as simple as you open them up, you open up your document, and you just place your mountains, you place your hills, you place cities or villages. I have released some that are focused on cities. So like it's like city blocks, and you can just lay them out like a medieval village. I've seen somebody doing some really cool stuff with that lately. I even have some battlefield sets, which are like kind of weird maps to make because it's like trying to communicate like a battle. But usually it has some really interesting stuff with like soldiers or knights on horses or whatever. And so it's like aspects of that. So if you wanted to have a map of a battle, you could do that. So I have a few of those. I have one that's kind of weird. It's like a road. It's like a road map. And I don't remember when it comes from exactly, but it basically always shows the road straight up, even if the road starts to turn. And you know it turns because they'll turn the compass on each of it. And so they'll lay out like they'll lay out like 5 of these next to each other, and it just shows what the road would be like in front of you when you have elevations, and then like the compass will slowly rotate across the 5 to show you that it's actually this long curve. And like they were these maps that they would make for people that were traveling on foot around England in, I want to say they're 16th century. I could be wrong. And so like it's a really interesting format to create, this kind of road journey, which you don't really see very often. Most of the time you see a bit of a different type of a map where you pull out more. So I just started like all these things are in the public domain, so it felt weird to charge for it. So I released them for free. You can use them in commercial or personal projects, doesn't matter. You don't have to pay some stock photo site a bunch of money, like because all these things are hundreds of years old. So I'm just taking something that's out there and putting them in a way that's easy to kind of apply and digest. So yeah.
Couple questions on those. How many have you done so far? Like how many distinct sets?
I think I'm at like 24, 25.
Awesome.
I have like 3 that are currently not finished, that are just basically sitting out there right now. The first time that I'm taking one guy, Defer, who I mentioned earlier. I'm actually going to do what I'm calling a settlement set, which focuses mostly on location stuff. So like villages, towns, mansions, a battlefield set, and then more of a cartography set. So like, and they're all kind of different, but they're all coming from one guy. And he was really prolific. So I was like, oh, it'll be fun. I'll do kind of this 3 sort of tier thing. So I'm working on that right now. Nice. But yeah, I think I'm at like about 25. I've won.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the goal, so I started this in 2019. Then 2020 rolled around. We were in the pandemic. I was stuck at home. I was like, I'll release one a month, and I think I released 13 in 2020. So nice. Like I hit the goal and then some. So,
what's your date range? So what's the oldest brush set you have, and what would be the most modern?
Oldest probably goes into the 16th century. And then the most modern will get up into the mid 18th century. Well, early 19th century, mid 18th century. I don't know. I don't have numbers right off the top of my head. So it's like, I'm trying to remember. It's really hard to find resources before the 16th century. Like we're talking like, the rule of thumb, if people don't know, is the century is always actually the years before it. So the 16th century is really the 1500s. Mm-hmm. Because it ends, it's named after the year it ends on. So like you start to get back into like the 1100s or whatever. Like map stuff is like, it's like church documents, and they're all like very illuminated manuscript wise, and there's not much there to go off of. Or they're the maps that were coming out of the Middle East at the time, which are gorgeous, but again, are almost like it's showing coastlines and mountains in ways that you can't really use. And I think if you're going to do that, you almost want to hire an illustrator to mimic that style, because it's not something that I can take elements from that you could just drop easily, because they were done in these kind of like gorgeous sort of paintings to present to kings or for a merchant, to carry around as like, look at my gorgeous map of North Africa or what have you. And like they were accurate. They showed ports and stuff. Like they weren't. I'm not knocking on. They're just a very different thing. But if you're going to go that route, like it would absolutely establish place and time. Yeah. So like you're like, my world is set in like the height of the Persian Empire. Like there's certainly a way you could communicate that really effectively with maps. So I mean, more power to you if you want. It's just hard to actually get resources from that. And I have a lot of people have come and asked, like, why aren't they earlier than that? It's really just hard to find stuff that you can actually glean from. There is one that comes from a Roman document that I might end up trying to do something with. It's really just a super long map. It's showing like coastlines and cities on the coastlines. And it's really just cities. Like they don't really go into details on mountains or roads or anything like that. It's just like, here's a village, here's a village, here's a village, here's Rome. Rome's important. Here's a village, here's a village, here's a village. Rome's back that way. Yeah. It's like a little bit of that. So, and
where can people find your brush sets?
On my website, just KMAlexander.com. Up in the menu under I have a free stuff section, and my fantasy map brushes are there. I usually post about them on Twitter or on Instagram when I release a new set as well. And then a lot of people, like the Wonder Draft has their own community where you'd go to get those. And I do link to that from my site if you are a Wonder Draft user. Then you can just download everything from me. And I have a few other little resources up there as well, from border stuff to like compass roses that come in a variety of languages if you want a Spanish or a French one or what have you. So there's a few other things out there as well that I also have. So yeah, they're just all up on the website.
All right, so let's jump back into talking about adding our maps to books.
Mm-hmm.
Are there cases, so we've talked a little bit about how it's not necessary to have one. You don't have to have one, but are there times when it can even be detrimental, do you think?
It's really going to depend on the author, I think, in this case. It's going to be detrimental to you when you're writing. If you're relying on the map to do heavy lifting for you, your book's probably not going to be very compelling. The book should not do that heavy lifting. Like, that should happen in the prose. This is why I never released a map for, like, Lovat in my book. If I can't communicate what Lovat is like in a way that's effective and kind of give people, like, I'm not doing a very good job, and it won't be nearly as compelling as trying to explain, a multi-level, megapolis to somebody. Like, it's more compelling to describe some of that stuff than it is to just rely on the map to do that sort of thing. So to me, I treat maps for my series as like a secondary thing to kind of build the world out. I have 2 maps. I'm finishing up a 3rd right now. The first one is kind of like, it's like a road map, like the kind of thing you'd pick up at a truck stop, with like ads running down the sides and stuff.
That's cool.
But it's like heavily notated by Waldo, the main character in the book. And it's really there to enhance the experience and build the world out. So that was the intent. The one that I just released that came out with Gleam Upon the Waves is a nautical chart of basically where the events take place. And it's very nautical charty and very different as a result. But like, I like that juxtaposition of like, there's no one type of map that we use within the world, and there wouldn't be within any world. So like, I like kind of using it as a way to expand the world. Yeah. None of it is necessary for my books, but it is a way to kind of grow the world beyond the books, which I like to do. So that would be the thing that I think it'd be detrimental to the writer themselves. Like, I think if you're relying on your map to do any heavy lifting, then you're not using the map effectively. It should enhance, not replace.
So if you're adding a map, are there certain things that you find come up as common mistakes or elements that are just typically hard to get right? Yeah.
I think you see this with a lot of, I use the word amateur here very loosely because I consider myself an amateur. Like, I don't do this. There's professional cartographers. I'm not a professional cartographer. I'm just an enthusiast. 2 things that I think people don't get right. The first one is just mountain ranges, like how mountain ranges form, how mountains age, which requires some sort of knowledge of plate tectonics. That said, you're in a fantasy world, right? You're writing fantasy, essentially. And you can come up with anything. Like, you can magic your way out of anything. But you need to, like, that's what will make it special. So if everything is just random and wrong, then it's just going to feel random and wrong, and you never mention why that is. But if you're like, this mountain range was formed here because the fairy god came and rose it up from the land and created this like wall of mountains around, the province or whatever, then you have a reason and it becomes fantastic. People talk a lot of crap about Mordor. And that's the reason why I brought up Square in particular, because mountain ranges don't normally form like that. If you look at Mordor, it's like kind of this little box, and you don't see that's just not a typical thing. And so people clown on Tolkien for that. It doesn't mean that he may have had a reason. Like, Tolkien, if anybody is doing stuff on the side that expands his world, it's him. He may have had a reason. But it's like knowing kind of how mountain ranges form on the edges of plate tectonics and how they age and how they, change, I think is important. You don't have to get hung up on it. Just look at how the world is and look at how mountains form and just kind of follow rough like guidelines for that. More importantly, and this is a big pet peeve, a big mistake that I see a lot is rivers. Rivers, it doesn't take very long to look up the hydrology of rivers and kind of knowing the patterns that they fall within. So there's like dendritic and like radial, and we don't have to get into all of them right now, but rivers always flow into a bigger river and then flow to a sea, or to an exit point. That's how they always work. And a lot of times I'll see rivers that like cross continents and go from one ocean to the other. And it's like, no, you now have two islands there. Like
it's a canal.
Yeah, that's not a river. And I think, again, rivers rarely split. So water always flows in the direct, like with the least resistance. I know lots about rivers. I'm writing a book about rivers. You've beta read my book about rivers.
I haven't.
So I've done tons of research on this. So that's rivers always flow like the Mississippi River, because it meandered for so many years before we basically put dikes along the whole thing and kind of started to control it. It would change all the time, and like you'd get a blockage upstream, and all of a sudden, like Mark Twain talks about this, like a town that was a river town is now on the other, it's now 10 miles away from the river because the river went a different direction. So when you have a meandering river and it starts to split, eventually it'll just leave that other flow and just go to the path of the least resistance. So that's where you get like the formation of oxbow lakes, which are like these weird little kind of horseshoe lakes that exist along rivers, because essentially that was part of the river and then it got cut off and then the river never flowed that way again. So like if you're going to have a river split, like have a reason for it that makes it special. That's the cool part about it is you can break all these rules, especially in fantasy, less in historical fantasy, but in fantasy, you can break all these rules. You just have to be able to call out why this is happening, because I think when you do that, then it becomes special, and then it becomes more interesting than just these two rivers. Like that just doesn't, like that sort of thing doesn't happen. So like those are the things that I think come to mind a lot.
Gotcha. Any other particular pet peeves?
Yeah. This is one more thing on map elements, and I have a few other that's more just choices. People need to eat. You need to have farmland. You can't just have endless forest. Like there needs to be farmland that provides food for people. Not everybody's going to be a mountain man that's gleaning berries and eating game. Like it just isn't a thing that like a large population can survive on. So keep that sort of stuff in mind. Like think about how much farmland is in Europe. There's a lot. And if you're a pre-agriculture book, you don't have to worry about it. But if you're, any book with like that's a big part of your map is knowing like where the agriculture is. The other thing too, and this is maps that are designed for an era that doesn't fit the story. So they're like, and this is different from the George R. R. Martin stuff, which is all data. It's not trying to, evoke, feelings of the courts or anything like that. Yeah. But if you use something like that and you're set in like an urban fantasy, it's going to feel out of place unless it is acknowledged that it's a historical document. I've seen a few people that do that. The other thing and this is starting to get into actual construction, pay attention to what I refer to as the stroke size. So that means the size of, like if you were painting something, your brush stroke is going to be a certain width. And if you're placing objects, make sure that they all feel like they're kind of coming from the same size. I've seen people like stretch their objects way larger, and so it feels like it's like this whole other thing that comes from a different like part of like a different set. Even if it's not, they're just like, I want a really big mountain. Go find a really big mountain. Don't take a different brush and then hope that it's going to fit, because it probably won't. It'll look different. The other thing with construction is your maps have to look good in black and white. And I know we all love color maps, and those are really fun. And there are people that read on their phones or read on tablets. Most book publishers are only going to print in black and white for your map. You'd be a very special snowflake if they're going to do a full color interior printing. And a lot of times, color maps that aren't done right can look really, really muddy and become unreadable. And that goes into my final point, which is even if you have a standard 6x9 hardcover book, that's not a lot of space cutting your map in. Let's say your map's horizontally laid out like most are. You cut them in half and have one on one side, one on the other. That's not a lot of space to really be able to read little details. So you really need to make sure your map is also readable at small sizes, which I think is something else. Just recently I got a book. I love the book, but like the map in the front it was color. It got printed in black and white, and it's so small that like it's hard. It's tough to read. Doesn't mean people couldn't figure it out, but like it just was a bummer because the map itself is really cool. And I was like, oh man, this is a really cool map. And if I looked at it on my phone, it's like in full color and looks super great. And it's like, I almost advise people anymore is like, if you have a map for your book, put it online. Just put it in a reader resource section on your website. Let people go get it. They can pull it up as they're reading your book. They have it on their phone. Everybody's got a phone in their pocket these days. So it's not hard to like provide that resource in a way that then they can zoom in and like find whatever they need. Because a lot of times the book won't be that great unless you really, really focus on making sure that it looks good in black and white. And then half the time it's just, you're going to want to give more details that you can always fit in a 6x9 piece of paper, which isn't very big. It's pretty small. So those are things that come to mind. I would say that are both pitfalls that people make, things that bother me, and just things to look out for when you're making your own maps. It's like, I think it's all things that are easily overlooked sometimes. And you wouldn't necessarily know unless you've been working in design or with, art for print ever. And yeah.
Any elements that you think should be used more in maps?
I think it's going to just go back to what you're trying to communicate with the map. I wish people would get away from always doing the same style of map. Like like there's so many different types of maps out there. There's so many different mapping resources. Any of the major museums now have like full on like open source. You can go through and look up old maps on, the Met or the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress or whatever. Go look up old maps. Look up maps. It's like you don't always have to follow kind of the Tolkien, the Ptolemaic style where it's kind of like, signs, this is a mountain, this is a village, this is a mountain, there's other ways to do that sort of stuff. I would love to see more Hatcher style maps, which is the type of relief where they would like draw in little lines. They call them fuzzy caterpillars in the design world a lot of times for like the mountains and stuff. Cause I just think it's really interesting. I mentioned that roadmap before, which was just a really cool find, which just, I think it'd be neat to see a story told that way. Cause a lot of stories are traveling stories and it's like, oh, why not do something a little bit different? There's just a lot out there. And I feel like it's really easy just to kind of lock into what other people have done and not really try to kind of explore some of the more unique ways to communicate via the idea of a map. So I think research and find something that fits. Like you'd be surprised at like what kind of weird maps kind of crop up from all sorts of time periods. So.
All right, Mr. Alexander, it is last call here in the Indie Pub. Can you give us an indie published book or two or three or more that you want more people to check out?
I just picked up Lisi Conley's A Ritual of Bone. It is a Dead Saga. It's the Dead Sagas books. He has 2 out right now. I think a third is coming. So I'm not a zombie fan anymore. I just think they're overplayed unless something really unique. And this is a zombie book set in like a Viking era sort of society. So it's like Norse versus zombies is the best way to describe it. I'm not very far into it, but I've been really liking it. And So that one comes to mind. The other one, which I beta read, I haven't read the final version yet, is Jason VanHee's The Wicked Blade, which is kind of a late. It's kind of Arthurian in its tone. It focuses on like a later in life, like Morgan Le Fay, and deals kind of with aftermath of Arthur's dead, Merlin's gone, like something else. So it's pretty short. It's like a little novella, but that just came out. Would be worth checking out. So those two are the two that come to mind right now.
Nice. Okay, same question, but for any media, indie or not.
All right, I got more books. That's mainly what I do. I read books, or I write books, or I bake maps, I guess. Blacktongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. He's normally a horror writer. This is, I don't want to say it's his first, but it is a fantasy. It is funny. It's crass. It's really compelling. Really interesting thoughts on just like language, which is something I'm a big fan of. Just like that, like the ideas around there. Cool world. Very much worth checking out. Laurel Hightower is a horror writer. She wrote Whispers in the Dark, which I thought was very good. Had a lot of heart to it. And she also wrote a book called Crossroads, which just came out. I haven't read Crossroads. It's in my to my TBR pile, but I really liked Whisper in the Dark enough that I went and bought the Crossroads book. They're not connected, but good, solid horror writing. And then a author you and I are both fans of, Jeff Noon, has his John Nyquist series. He's the guy who wrote, Noon wrote Vert, which is incredible.
Yeah.
The John Nyquist series is super weird, genre mishmash. Man of Shadows, it's kind of noir-esque. It takes place in the cities where one is light and one is darkness, and then there's like this like murky space in between. Absolutely fascinating, incredible mind towards like just world building. And this one's a little bit more approachable than I think Vert is. I don't always recommend Vert to everybody because Vert is also
it's a lot.
It's a lot, yeah. And this one's a little bit more straightforward while still being super weird. So those are three non-indie titles that come to mind as well. So yeah.
All right, tell our listeners what you have going on right now and where they can find you and your work.
Let's see. Well, I just released Gleam Upon the Waves, so that is out. It's available pretty much everywhere in ebook and or paperback. I sell signed copies through my website if you want a signed copy, and you get a bunch of extra stuff with that. You can find me at KMAlexander.com. That's my blog, which I'm pretty active on. I also am on Twitter and Instagram. I'm currently working on doing research stuff for book 5 of the Bell Forging Cycle. I'm revisiting a manuscript, which I mentioned earlier, my Rivers manuscript, let's call it that, as well. So I'm doing that. I got a couple more map stuff that I've been working on. And then I still am doing those fun little kind of animated vignette stuff, which is really just kind of building out the world of the Bell Forging Cycle. So I do these like really complex, detailed animations that are like little looping 30-second videos that are a little creepy sometimes. And yeah, so kind of noir-esque that I've been releasing as well that people seem to be digging. So I get good emails about them. So I will keep making those. So that's what I'm doing.
Nice. And where can we find you, your socials and your blogs and such?
KMAlexander.com is where there'll be links there to all my social media. I'm KM_Alexander on Twitter, and I'm just KM Alexander on Instagram. So those are the places to find me.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Indie Pub. If you like what you hear, consider giving us a like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our indie investigations or boozy banter. I've been your host, Jay Rushing, and we'll see you back in the pub next time.